Hello and welcome to DataCast Solutions Introduction to KNIME for the Data Analyst. In this chapter now we're going to start to talk about grouping data. The group by node and its kind of distant cousin, the pivot node, are exceptionally useful. I would think there's very few workflows where I haven't used the group by node. So this particular chapter is really going to be mostly just hands-on demonstration and showing you different ways to make use of that group by node. KNIME actually provides me two different methods to deduplicate a table. One is with the duplicate row filter and the other is with the group by. I tend to prefer the group by more often because I'm in a lot more control over the fields that are not part of the deduplication process. But to understand that, let's first look at the more simplistic way of doing it, which is here I'm going to search for the duplicate row filter over here on the bottom. And I'll drag this up and connect up. And let's say at this moment, part of the database I have here is every movie you've ever rented. Now, I don't care if you've rented a movie 3 times. I just want the unique list of all the movies you've rented. And as a result, so what I'm going to do is say I don't care about the rental ID or the date. I've got the customer ID and the title. And the return date that you brought back, that's not part of the uniqueness of it. And which person you rented it from, and what staff ID you got it from in the last. Those are the two. I just want that as my duplication. And then with my advanced, what am I going to do? Do I remove them, which is of course generally what I do. And for all of the non-selected fields, what do I want to do? Do I want to take the first, the maximum, the last? You choose what's going to happen. Like I said, in the group by node, you get a lot more control because you control by the individual field. So I'm going to say just take the first one for each one of them. That's good enough. And now when I execute this, I can hover over here and see I had 16,044 records. I've now got 15,828. So I have deduplicated. The data is still the same, but what I've done is deduplicate, so now the title is unique for each customer, and I've got just the first record for that customer. So one of the first things I like to do with the group by node, and very often do, is to create simply a list of unique values within one or more fields. So what I'm going to do here, and throughout this chapter, I've got a database reader, and I've read my movie history database. So this is basically a list of all the rentals. What movies have been rented by which customers? So let's start with the assumption right now that I wanted to create a list of unique customers and how many times they've rented each movie. So I'm going to go ahead and search for the group by node, and I'll just double click it to connect it to the node that was already highlighted. And I'm going to turn around and just say I want customer ID and the movie title. And that's it. I'm not going to do any aggregation, so this is just a unique list of each customer and the movie that they have rented. Now if I hover over here, I can see I've got 16,044 records. Yet when I look here, there's only 15,828. And what I can infer from that is to mean that some customers have actually rented a movie more than one time. And that's going to become a useful piece of information to me for a lot of different reasons, depending on the application. So let's go ahead and instead, let's alter this group by. I'm going to double click on it, and for each movie title, I'm going to click into the manual aggregation table, and I'm going to take the rental ID record, and I'm going to count how many times. You see I've got a number of options available to me: maximum, mean, min, average. Well, I'm just going to count the number of times that they've rented this movie, and for the rental date, I'm going to take the first date they rented, and take the rental date again and take the last date that they rented that movie. So I'm now going to have three fields. And the column naming, it's going to take the aggregation method with the column name. So it'll say last rental date, first rental date, count of rental IDs. So now let me execute this node again, and I'll view my output. And now I can still see most people have only rented a movie once, but I've got the sum of their first and max. So let me sort this in descending sequence. And I can see, okay, this movie, customer 314, has rented Caddyshack Jedi 3 times. The first time was on July 7th. The last time was on July 30th. So over the course of 3 weeks, they rented it 3 times. It's fair to say they like this movie. What might I do with information like this? Well, many video companies buy multiple copies of new release movies, and then as the sale of those movies begin to slow down, they want to try and sell those movies. Well, this is an easy application to use that for. I might turn around now and say, I'm going to turn to these customers and offer them to sell them a copy at a significantly reduced rate, because I know they like it and I'm far more likely to get them to buy it. So that's, to start with, just the very typical uses of what we would use the group by node for. All right, so let's look at a different option to create something similar to group bys, which is aggregates, and that's going to be the pivot. A pivot, as you see, there's pivoting and unpivoting when I do a search on the nodes. Pivoting is taking multiple rows and rolling them up into one row. Unpivoting is taking one row and breaking it down into multiple rows. I'm going to basically pivot a table and then unpivot it back to where it came from. So I'm going to drag the pivot node up here, and I'm going to take the same data file and route it into this node as well. And I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to say, in this case, I want to group on the customer ID. And then the pivoting column, the next tab that I'm going to choose, is to say, I want to take the movie title that they've done, and for the manual aggregation, I want to say the rental date. Basically, who do they rent it? When do they rent that movie? And that's it, just those 3 columns. And I'm going to go ahead and execute this node. And I've got 3 different outputs here. I've got group totals, pivot totals, and the pivot table. The pivot table itself is what I want to look at first. Now, for each customer and for each movie that we have in title, I've got the dates that they are rented. So you can see as I scroll across, I've basically taken every title. Many of them are null because the person never rented that movie, but many of them are not. So as I scroll left, if I turn around here and sort, for example, on the average rental date for Adaptation Holes, the movie, and I sort that, I've now got, here's a list of customers that have rented this movie. And as I scroll across, you can start to gain some insight into some of the same movies that those people have also rented. And I can start to look for patterns as I scroll across and say, are there going to be, this is what will be referred to as market basket analysis. We'll do that later in the class to say, this person rented a lot of these same people rented the same movies, and we can use them for recommendations when we start building up our recommendation engine. So that's basically what this is all about. So pivoting has now brought me down to only 599 rows, 1 for each customer, and then for each movie title, when did they rent it, if they rented it. But the final way of dealing with aggregation that I want to be able to handle is the idea of using the group by to create a collection column. So I'm going to drag the group by again and make a connection from the table. And once again, in this case, I'm going to take the customer ID, and for the manual aggregation, I'm going to take the title of the movie that they've rented. And instead of taking the first movie or the last movie, I'm going to take a sorted list. I could just do a list, or in my case, I'm going to choose a sorted list. This is a list of every movie that this customer has rented. And click OK and execute it. Now what I have for my output is customer 1, and you notice this column isn't a string or an integer, or its data type shows a bracket sign. This is a list of all of the movies that that customer has rented in their lifetime. I'm going to be able to use this very much as a mechanism to say, based on your ability to rent this movie, the likelihood that you're going to want to rent another movie. This is exactly how companies like Netflix make their recommendation engines, exactly how Amazon does it. They look at all the things you've purchased and compare them to all the things other customers have purchased to make recommendations to you of what might be purchased next. So this is a collection column. Now with that collection column, oftentimes you'll get this delivered to you in a workflow, and you're going to want to know how to work with a collection column in some way. And KNIME is going to provide you a few different mechanisms for dealing with that. So let's look at a few different ways that you can handle getting a collection column.
The existence of a collection column offers us 3 options that we can do. We can convert that collection to a string, so it's just a comma-separated list of values, or we can split each one into its own individual cell, or we can split it so that each value turns into its own separate row. Which one you do depends on which one you need. So let's take a look at how to do each one of those. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to use the ungroup command and take the ungroup node, and I'll connect that up to the output. And when I look at my group table, see I have the sorted list, and now the only columns that show are the ones that are of a data type of collection, because that's all ungroup can do. So when I execute this and look at the output, you can now see I've actually got one row for each value. So the column has remained the same, but each individual value has been broken up into its own separate row. And then you'll see the second column there, and as we scroll down, third. So each one has its own value. Now the next one I want to do is split the collection, and there is a node to do that, and it is the split collection, and I'm connecting it to the same output, the same group by. So instead of putting each one, I'm going to take each one and break it out. I'm choosing the column that's available to me that is a collection, and I'm going to break each one out into its own separate value. So when I execute this and then look at the output, I can now see the sort table list has been broken out into each individual value. So each value has been put into its own separate column with the same number of rows. I still have 599 rows available to me. So now the last one I want to do is a collection to a string. I want to convert that collection. I want to leave it alone just as is, as a comma separated list of values. So I'm going to use the collection to string, which is one of the extension nodes that we installed. And it, of course, only allows me to choose the column. I'm going to remove the prefix and the suffix. I don't want the brackets, and I'm going to leave the column separator alone as a list of comma-separated values. So I can click OK, and I'll execute that. And now when I look at the output, you see it's no longer a column type. It's now a string instead of a collection column. So I'm able to work with it. I can do what I want with it, pass it on, put it in a database, or whatever else I might have to do. So now that we've converted it to a string, let's go ahead and pull a row filter out here. And because it's a string, I can now work with this and search for values inside of it. So I'm going to take that column Okay, and let's say I want to take the movie Gold River, and I want to know anybody who's rented that movie. So what I'm looking for is I'm going to use a wildcard and say I'm looking for Gold River, but I need an asterisk before and after, and then I'll tell it that this string contains wildcards. And I'm looking for rows that have this value. So I click OK, and now I execute that node. And when I look at the output, I've now got a list of all of the people who have rented the movie Gold River, along with all the other movies that they've already rented collected with it. So it allows me to work with things simply as strings. And those are the three methods we have available for dealing with collections.
Now the last thing I want to show you to do as part of aggregation is just the ability to sort your table. So I'm going to take, you've seen me sort the output, but that's a temporary process. The actual file still remains in the file order you've given it. So I'm going to actually drag a sorter node out here. And I'm going to take this file and connect it to the database reader. And I can add as many keys as I want. So I want to sort this by customer ID. And then I want to add another rule and sort it by rental date in descending order. And then I want to sort it by maybe the staff ID that they rented it from. And apply that rule and execute it. And if I right click and look at my sorted table now, I've now got everything in customer ID order, followed by the descending sequence of the dates that they've actually rented these movies. And then the final was who they rented them from. So if I rented 2 movies on this date, I actually rented them from 2 different people. I rented one at 1 o'clock in the morning and the other at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's when they returned them. So, but they've rented this movie. I'm sorry, I was looking for one where they rented on the same date. And typically that should be that way. They rented them from the same person. So when somebody's got multiple rentals like that, they rented this one at 15 from John Stevens, and then they rented this one at 1801 from Mike Hillard. So they rented a movie and they came back 3 hours later and rented it from someone else. Again, just sorting. Within the output, of course, you can turn around and resort anything you want as a result of the group by table. I can turn around and sort this by descending rental date and look at when people actually supplied the data. But when I want to look at this in multiple aggregations of descending, ascending sequence, using the sorter node is a way to actually view that.
This concludes this chapter of the class. Feel free to move on to the next chapter.